What is For Humanity? We are a nonprofit charitable organization built for a singular mission to examine and analyze downside risk associated with AI and autonomous systems, and where possible, to identify risk mitigations to manage those downside risks and get the best possible result from these systems for humanity. We are a volunteer-driven organization with 450 contributors and fellows from 46 countries around the world, building an infrastructure of trust with independent audit of AI systems. A crowdsourced process where we've drafted over 5,000 lines of audit criteria for AI and autonomous systems of many kinds. We provide these audit rules to governments and regulators. We do not have authority and we do not seek authority. We aim to be a service provider to governments and regulators around the world. We also advise and train those jurisdictions about the roles and responsibilities that exist in an infrastructure of trust. A big part of this process is to ensure human agency remains over these systems, requiring diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback, not at the outcomes level, but at the design, development, and risk assessment level, to ensure feedback loops to manage these risks and maximize perspectives. We also have identified accountability and governance structures inside organizations to ensure that compliance is met. Our approach is multi-vector. It focuses on 5 specific categories that are a holistic approach to AI and autonomous systems: ethics, bias, privacy, trust, and cybersecurity. What we do is an art. We craft laws, regulations, guidelines, and standards into auditable rules. That means they are binary, and auditors are able to correctly assess if compliance has been met or not met. We also work with accreditation services to create a process for accrediting entities to issue certifications of compliance. And finally, we train and certify individuals to perform audit and pre-audit service. For Humanity is not an auditor, nor a pre-audit service provider. We do this training to ensure that individuals know how to certify companies, how to see compliance, how to recognize that documentary evidence has satisfied these criteria. And we also provide a body of knowledge, a way to see when complex issues of compliance have met sufficient and necessary standards to achieve compliance and to mitigate risks to humans. This is who we are, this is what we do, and we do it on behalf of humanity.
Hello, I'm Sarah Clark. I'm one of the For Humanity Fellows, and I was asked to talk a little bit about the body of knowledge and how that relates to what For Humanity does in general.
My name is Joshua Buckley. I'm a fellow for Humanity, and I'm here today to offer a peek into some of the work that For Humanity is doing, in particular with regards to the BOK, or the body of knowledge.
The For Humanity body of knowledge is information and reference points and benchmarks and external guidance that links to the subsets of criteria that we have in our For Humanity audits. We've built all these audit criteria, and we realize that if we're training certified auditors across all of these varying domains, across privacy, bias, ethics, security, trust, we need to make sure that they have confidence in the depth of knowledge necessary to work out if something is a sufficient control, to look for signs that it may be in insufficient control to pass the audit, and to signpost best practice or mature practice and ways to reach that point. The body of knowledge is split down into discipline relevant knowledge stores. Those knowledge stores have owners. Oftentimes those owners are not what you might consider to be a subject matter expert in the field, but what they are doing is gathering together those people with the very best current knowledge in those fields and coordinating the input into a standard format so we can share that with our certified auditors as part of the accredited training courses that we're offering to enable people to then perform audits against our criteria.
As Sarah mentioned, the BOK is a repository of best practices that is designed to supplement the learning outcomes and audit rules that make up For Humanities audit certification. Let's take the Code of Ethics knowledge store, for example. We see that line 17 in the audit states that an entity shall have a code of ethics adhering to industry standards and in compliance with the relevant legal frameworks, and that this code shall be published in the entity's employee handbook. But what are industry standards for a code of ethics? What should an auditor look for when judging the quality of a code of ethics? How can an auditor tell whether an entity's code of ethics appropriately sets out the legal frameworks that are relevant to said code and the entity in question? These are the kinds of questions that can influence the confidence with which an auditor is able to make his or her determinations about compliance. And they are the kinds of questions that the BOK in general, and knowledge stores in particular, are designed to clarify. As a result, each knowledge store puts forward a detailed definition of the concept in question, as well as setting out a list of criteria for sufficiency, things that must be present within the code of ethics for an auditor to confidently make an assertion about compliance, as well as indicators of maturity, things which, if present, signal that the code of ethics goes above and beyond what is required by the audit. In the case of codes of ethics, sufficiency includes things like, was the code drafted and is it kept up to date by the entity's ethics committee? Does it clearly set out the entity's shared moral framework? And does it contain compliance-based, value-based, and fiduciary-based commitments or considerations? Indicators of maturity, on the other hand, include things like, does the code provide explicit context to the sorts of ethical choices that employees will be making? Does it include a commitment to making employees aware of the code and its contents? Is the code long enough to provide enough, but short enough to act as a reasonable and usable ethical guide for employees? Overall, the BOK and knowledge stores like that for the Code of Ethics are integral to the work that For Humanity does, will be integral to the work that auditors do, and can be an amazing place to get started as a new contributor or fellow. So I urge you all to get involved and would like to invite anyone who is interested or who has any questions to reach out to Sarah, Ryan, or myself for more information.
We will only be able to create this infrastructure of trust, this audit of AI on behalf of humanity, for humanity, if we invite everybody to the table and incorporate the best of those views into the best kind of guidance.
Hey, good morning, and welcome to day 2 of For Humanities at Go. And we have the pleasure of being the first panel discussion today. So I hope you guys are all ready. Just wanted to, this is about the AI effect on credit worthiness and how to measure progress. And just want to expand on the For Humanity introduction. It is a not-for-profit. And why I joined initially was to, when I joined, the reason I really got into For Humanity is that the first thing that I came across of when Ryan introduced me to it was these spreadsheets in terms of, okay, how do we go about, looking at, auditing and looking at cybersecurity and ethics and all those stuff. And then I felt that it was a really, very active way and practical way of looking at things. And so that's why I joined. But it is a not-for-profit. And so I want to thank our panelists here, Marino, Ted, Peter, and Nick, for donating their time and their expertise to this panel. So welcome, guys. How are you doing?
Doing well.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Doing well.
So let me first, look at each, introduce you guys really quickly. And part of this whole thing is we're always learning something. So I'm going to ask you a question in terms of, what's a recent learning experience that you just had? So let me just start with Marino. So Marino comes out of, he's joining us. Well, he's in New York, but he's joining us from New Zealand. So thank you for coming in. Marino, you want to introduce yourself really quick? You're on mute. I think you're still on mute. No, not coming in. Well, let me just give you a quick. So Marino has worked 10 plus years in technology, risk, and compliance. He's the head of risk and business governance at ANZ for the Institutional Business at Americas. And he's got global experience in the USA, New Zealand, Australia around regulatory and risk management. And he holds a Bachelor of Law and Bachelor of Science and Health from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Can you? No, I still can't hear you yet. Okay, I'm going to come back because I really want to know what your latest learning experience has been. So Peter, let me bring in. So Peter's Memon is the head of analytics at FactSet. He has more than 30 years of experience. I didn't want to age you there, Peter, though. Sorry. And he's got a lot of work in the financial services, including JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Lehman Brothers, and so forth. Peter, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Paul. I mean, if Paul said, I have over 30 years experience. I think a significant portion of it's been working in the investment banks. I've also spent the last decade or so working in analytics, started my own analytics firm, and that's been my primary focus for at least like the last 10, 12 years.
And what comes to mind as terms of a learning experience?
These days, my focus happens to be a lot around NLP and diving into that specialty and how we can use it.
Awesome. So Nick is the VP of Special Projects Advisory Services Privatar. He also comes out of MasterCard, where he worked on safe analytic solutions in the payment space. Nick, do you want to add on to that at all?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is in my career, I think it's been the evolution of going from protecting data and being actually managing data to protect it and those things to becoming a steward of data, where we start to realize that data itself is actually people, and how do we protect people versus just zeros and ones. So that's been my evolution. And probably my last learning experiences that exist today is I just came out of a high performance computing symposium where we started to talk about the balance between the GPU and the CPU so that we can actually begin to bring privacy and data protection closer to where decisions are made, especially when you think about credit scoring, you think about being able to do things online today. So that was probably the biggest part, is just seeing how those two are becoming interrelated, with the CPU is actually coming right to the edge, which is exciting work. Gives us more power at those points of interaction.
Okay. And what recent learning experience can you?
Well, that was it. It's the GPU to the CPU. Sorry, that was my latest learning experience. Was how the computing power is getting to the edge. Sorry.
Okay. Also, can I also add that you're going way back in your experience that you were a special character?
Oh,
at a special place?
So I was a cast member at the Walt Disney Company. So way back when I was just a young pup applying analytics to parks and resorts, and I was a character. I was Tigger when I was at the Walt Disney World Resort. So I got to play Tigger while I was also doing data and analytics. So great experience. And if you were there in the 90s, guess what? If you saw Tigger at Epcot, it's probably me in that costume. So what a great experience.
And no lie, so this morning I was looking for a toothbrush. And so I'm going through, all the back, going into the back of the closets and trying to find something. And I came up with a toothbrush. It's a kid's toothbrush. It's about this big, and it's a Tigger one.
There you go.
So I just want to add that in. Hey, Ted, welcome.
Morning, Paul.
Welcome. So one of the things I just want to add that Fiddler AI, and Ted will talk a little bit about that, and I think it's going to really add to our framework idea that we're going to talk about later. But they are a sponsor of this panel and of For Humanity. So Ted, I want to thank you for your time for joining us, and also to your company for helping to support this endeavor.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a strategic account executive with Fiddler. Just recently started. Prior to working with Fiddler, I spent the last 7 years in analytics, everything from data preparation to ML and AI model generation, working with some of the largest life sciences and financial services companies in the world. helping them take their data from ground zero, and probably what Peter and Nick are very involved with is taking that data and munging it together and coming up with and helping individuals create decision making for their organization.
And what's any recent learning experiences?
I did have a pretty interesting learning experience as I was getting a little bit prepped for this session. Is that bias isn't the only problem that's really impacting credit scores and credit worthiness and lending, and AI really can't help in that situation. What the problem is that when we start to look at bias, we're generally talking about low income or minority in groups. And what's really also impacting them in addition to bias is the lack of credit history and data that is available for making those types of decisions. So the that lack of data impacts the precision that's going on with the AI and ML algorithms and models. And this lack of precision then equates to inequality when you're talking about credit risk or lending.
Awesome. So Marino, can we hear you now?
Back. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yeah. You have a very pleasant voice, so we're excited to have you.
Wonderful. So something I learned, and this is probably not too related to AI, but in the last year and a half, obviously with COVID-19 pandemic, I was tasked, I run our business disruption program for our bank as well. So I was tasked to figure out how to make our institutional bank work from home, including our entire Marcus division, which was probably one of the hardest and complex problems I've had to solve, because as bankers and old school bankers, no one really wants to work from home. They don't believe in working from home, especially the traders. So getting all those approvals, sending everyone home, and getting all that set up was complex. We learn a lot about personalities and people. And the irony of that is now we can't get anyone to come back in the office. So, yeah.
I've been working from home for the last 7 years now, so
Yeah.
I'm in the office all the time.
Yeah. So we learn a lot about behavior there. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually, so the learning experience that I had is, I'm the scout leader for our troop for the Boy Scouts, Scouts BSA, and we had our camping this last summer. And in that, we had a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds and then 12-year-olds. And the 15 and 16-year-olds are supposed to lead the patrol, right? And so we're getting there and everybody's tired and so forth. And you can start seeing that all the frustration, right? Because you got this 15-year-olds are saying, okay, you need to do this. We need to get this done, all this stuff. And they got the 12-year-olds that are jumping around saying, they're just jumping around all over the place. And it was really frustrating to them. But you could see like the maturity level in just 2 days, that all of a sudden these, I mean, they're just 15. And they're trying to, figure out what to do, how to make this work. And they just change. Like overnight, their attitude just changed in how they were going to do things. And so what I learned from that is that if you give the people the right scenario, the right tools, they will end up growing, and they will end up doing the right thing. And I think part of that is that when we look at, we're talking about AI and the effect on credit worthiness and how to measure progress and so forth. I think in general, if you give people the right tools, they will end up doing the right thing. So start out on a positive note. So getting to, this panel, one thing that I saw some stats that came out of the payments magazine, where that banks and other financial institutions have tripled their use of artificial intelligence for credit risk, especially as the pandemic has has happened, and that's a response to that. But you guys start looking, what is the impact on having, impact on approvals and rejections, and are we doing that right? And so what I want to do is set up this panel and start looking at, okay, from a high level concepts, where do we see the problems or the challenges and the opportunities in automating, credit provisioning and all this risk. But in the end, where I want to get to is, and this with For Humanity is about solutions, is like, okay, let's sort of conceptualize what a framework might be in doing such a thing. So I want to start out, everybody talks about bias, right? And in the news and so forth, you'll start seeing that bias is, it's always has some sort of negative connotation. And, I look at bias as really more on a statistics type thing. There's not good, it's bad, it's just there. So Peter, what I'd like to start out with you is like, when you think of bias, what do you do you think of it?
To me, bias is different. I think the traditional view of bias, and I think everybody looks at bias as either racial disparities or income disparities in the data, but I think it's more nuanced than that. And I think very often when we develop these systems, and I forget who said it, but it's lack of data. There are certain segments of the population where we just don't have data, which in algorithms themselves aren't inherently biased. Math isn't biased. It's when we train these things, we don't have the right data to do it. And I think in a lot of cases, we have to look at maybe a broader set of data. And then I think I said this a while back is, my bias isn't your bias. It depends on the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah. And Marino, you when we met before, you started talking about really tying bias to strategy in the corporate world. Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I probably have a slightly different view of bias, and there's different, I guess, to prejudice and the traditional view, which Peter mentioned. But when you look at businesses, right, and I work in the institutional investment banking side, is that when you look at businesses and banks and creditworthiness, bias is really dependent on and having enough data, but looking at the branding of a client, customer, and maybe it doesn't make sense to give XYZ to, an X amount of dollars to a certain client, but because the client might be in Microsoft, Amazon, etc., you make it work, and it's an inherent bias in trying to ensure that, you have that client within your firm. And then you have the other end, which is, your strategy might also drive your bias. So you might have a strategy to just be purely sustainable, which means you are backing out maybe the oil gas industry, or you have a specific strategy on just technology firms, and you don't look at only certain types of technology firms, no startups, and then you start having bias on not really looking at startups. So from a business sense, I think it hasn't really solved itself, and I don't think AI is fully going to solve it, but there's going to be a lot of impact between strategy and how we look at businesses and how we can streamline that side. It impacts more, I guess, the smaller businesses, the startups, the fintechs, rather than the big ones, because I think the big players will always kind of get what they want, but then it kind of hides out the small players, right? So.
Mm-hmm. And Ted, with Fiddler AI, part of your capabilities is to, I guess, to expose algorithms and so forth, or what's happening, and alerting your clients of where bias may be there, and then a decision is made from that point. Is that what happens?
That's correct. We provide a platform that provides monitoring, explainability, as well as fairness and bias detection. So we are able to, essentially open a black box and understand what type of data are filtering into those different models and algorithms that are being created, and understand if there is bias within the data that's being utilized to make the predictions and go up against those models that are being created.
But you're just bringing it, you're just alerting or bringing it up to the forefront.
That's
it's not
correct.
Like you're not determining what is and what isn't.
That's correct. That's a determination that's made by an organization. We're just going to highlight what could be possibly construed as bias.
And Nick, you want to add to that from your experience?
Well, the biggest thing is kind of what Peter has said, is projecting, or math is it's not going to have bias, but as we project our expectations into that math, into the algorithm, that's where you start to see the bias. And I kind of take it from last time we talked with Peter, was, bias can be good and bias can be bad. I try to say is, I hope those expectations we put into a model are for the good side, especially when it comes to finances. It's not about mitigating the risk, can they make a payment? It's like, if I make an algorithm, how do I determine that they will make that payment, that business will be successful, that individual will be successful? So as you project into those expectations, those biases can be a positive way forward. And I think that's the part, is the myth is always it's negative, negative. But to Peter's point in our last conversation, I do believe it can be you can put positive biases into your algorithms to create the right expectations. And I think that's where we should be moving towards, so that we can accomplish those things, to do that, versus always worried about that mitigation of risk in a negative way versus, hopefully being able to make someone successful in what they're doing, especially in financials.
And I just want to move on. So, with you, Nick, I mean, we've done a lot of writing together, and you talk a lot about accountability and governance with regard to data privacy and things like that. Can you expand on what you think about of accountability and trust and the responsibilities around that?
Well, that's actually a big part of it. That's what this For Humanity is about, is that accountability and trust, is being able to pull back the curtain and understand how AI models were built, how machine learning models were built, so that you build that trust. It's no longer just that black box where someone's like, I don't understand, and that's where you create that people get real nervous about it. And it's the ability to sit back and say, I need to move towards trust through being able to say, all right, how was that model developed? Why was that model developed? And what was the intent of that model? And then what did we put inside that model to, basically get the outcomes that we're looking for? It is incumbent upon us in the last 3 years to be able to explain what is going on versus just, hey, the machine just took over. That's no longer an excuse, right? You can't use an excuse, because the regulators, the legal folks are asking that question of what's in there, and that's how you build that trust. That's how you start to be able to sit back as people say, okay, I understand what you were trying to accomplish and why you put certain things into your models, the attributes you put into your models, or why you did that way. And it's up to us to explain it. And we've got to explain it in plain language so that people can trust what was done, and what was done for a right purpose, not a bad purpose, because unfortunately most people go to the bad versus saying, oh, I understand that was actually being tried to be used for good and not bad. And that's just it, is I think the next 2 years is about uncovering the curtain, moving back the curtain.
So it really comes down to transparency. And just understanding, okay, this is why
that's
you
the
made
better
the decision.
term. And 2 seconds, you just summed up what I said in a minute and a half. So yeah, perfect.
Well, we have an hour. We have an hour and a half to fill. So.
Well, and I think, and that's the big part of it, Paul, is the transparency aspect, as Nick said, and that's been an ongoing conversation for a number of years. People look at artificial intelligence models as these big black boxes, and to a large degree, most people don't know how they actually work underneath the covers as well. So you're putting data in, something's coming out, and they don't know what's happening. And to an average person, and the media hasn't known the healthcare in any way, shape, or form, is this is bad. We don't know what these things are. We have no idea how they're working. You can to a degree explain traditional statistical models, but when you get into the realm of AI and these very sophisticated tools and the math behind them, we don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. And I think people get very nervous about that.
And Marino, in your world, I mean, there's an element of human review, isn't there? Like when you're looking at all these models. So what's the data? I guess maybe the day in the life of looking at all these credit models and the challenges that you find.
Yeah, no, definitely. So just something on what Peter said, I guess, is so obviously we have all these built engines in our banking system that makes decisions for whatever we're doing in terms of loans or credit or whatever product we're building on. But the funny thing is, sometimes the bankers don't build the engines, right? It's the engineers and effectively the credit people behind it helping build it. But sometimes the bankers themselves can't explain why a decision is a decision because it's plugged in a certain way. And they also, it's not just I guess trying to explain it to people outside the bank. The bankers, the people who own the product, the relationship managers also need to start understanding why a certain decision is being driven and why that's being driven. I think what we're doing in our bank is we're starting to educate them on AI and engineering and just understand the basics of how this all works. But in terms of the review factor, because we do work with in the big corporate world with so many different clients, when the machine, I guess, spits out a specific decision, there is always a human element. So we're not at the point where we just say, okay, we put everything into the system and this is the result. So we do look at the result, and there's two elements. There's a second line risk review element, there's the banker element who reviews it, and also a first line review. So almost three different teams that review the result, ensure the result makes sense. There's challenge, there's there's always almost every effect changes to the way the result looks and the numbers, but that's also because when you deal with big corporates and medium-sized corporates, you can't just rely specifically on AI to give you everything you need. We're not at that stage, but the positive aspect is that there is so much data for, most of these companies are listed. You can get all the information, the financials. So that's a positive element, but there is a very big human factor, and I think that needs to continue to overlay, I guess, what we're doing at the moment and where we are. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ted, so I mean, that's where, we're talking about earlier is sort of where Fiddler AI, alerts or looks at the transparent or tries to uncover what's going on, and then bringing that to human. To their attention, right?
Exactly, and that's what Peter and Nick were speaking to, and that's what Fiddler provides, and companies like Fiddler is that transparency to understand what is going on within that black box, so to speak. So, in near real time, we can help organizations uncover how those models are behaving, if there's drift, if there is possible bias. At any point in time, they can go and look at explainability and understand what's going on with the model, and it's interesting to me coming in this organization. This isn't Ted just speaking. There's numerous studies out there. Is that the lack of transparency that organizations have right now? There's many of the largest organizations out there who I would say aren't adequately monitoring and understanding what's going on with their algorithms, which are very fragile, prone to breaking, and are making critical business decisions on their behalf and the client's behalf. And there needs to be more done to really understand what's going on underneath and fixing those problems as quickly as possible.
Excellent.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, the part that we always talk about, and I think Ryan in the chat brings it up, is that explainability. And I think the one thing is there's the human element, which is us, but it's the technology that can actually help us with that transparency. It's the technology that can help us actually explain the workflow. From the time data is brought in from ingestion to the time we consume it and how it's consumed, that becomes really important when you talk about, as we move on with AI and ML, I can explain and show you how that data works through the system. If there's been data protection methods that are put on top of it, to try to hide some individuals so we don't look at those things, we can tell you the different elements that were part of that model. We can see how it moved through the system, who touched it, when was it touched. That explainability is really how we can use technology to help us build the storyboards to the story that we need to tell to explain what is going on. So I think that's a really good point to bring up, is that opportunity for us to use technology to help us within that transparency.
Yeah. And so Marina brought up a little, some real world experience in terms of, decisions made, and then, looking through it and evaluating and stuff like this. Anybody else have any stories in there of where, like Nick said, is like where technology, AI will help in a decision making, and it sort of changed someone's perspective on how to go forward? Nope. Peter, anything?
No, not for that one.
I just threw that one out.
I knew you did.
Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about so what we we're from a high level, we talked about accountability, transparency, and so forth, but I'm trying to think of like what would a framework look like, blue sky, that sort of thing, knowing what we know of where we can make sure that any of these credit decisions that are made are done well, and we are doing it right. So what's your what's your point, like Marina? What's your point? Like, okay, if someone says, "Are you doing it right?" What comes to mind? How do you measure it? I guess.
Yeah, so I guess in banking, in banking, it's a little bit easier because we are so heavily regulated, right? And if we are going to implement something that makes decisions that results in our consumer or customer or client, we have so many different frameworks within the bank, ensuring that we adhere to the regulations, whatever they are, which country we are, so in USA and which states we're in. But there's just so much testing, and we have specific teams that test it and give us, I guess, the assurances that it is working. But then, I guess, keeping all that technical things aside, we do have effectively governance teams that look, it's quite new, and we try to look at the data, the way decisions are being made, and actually review and challenge that. From a human perspective, not just ensuring that does the data, the algorithms, the outputs, do they abide to the regulations and what we as a bank want, but we're actually trying to go beyond that and say, are these decisions making sense? Are they ethical? Are they providing solutions that actually make sense from a, are we doing the right thing? So we have frameworks in place and we check off those, but I think things are so developing so fast and new, and the regulations have to catch up as well, that we're not quite there in having the perfect or right framework to test that and check that.
Peter.
That for a minute. I mean, I think what he's saying is absolutely correct. And the banks are highly regulated. They go through layers and layers, and these decisions have many layers of people that touch them. The models get reviewed by 47,000 people. You know, the inputs, the outputs, it's heavily regulated. I mean, that doesn't guarantee you're right. I mean, as we know, there is mortgage meltdowns. Models were incorrect. I mean, things are wrong. I think where things get really interesting is when you start getting into the consumer markets, when you start touching things like credit on demand, when you have decisions being made about access to credit in real time. Those are not regulated. Certainly not regulated to the degree that a bank is regulated. You know, you have a fintech startup over there who's got some fancy AI model who's making a decision about giving you credit to buy a purchase that you're doing online, and they're doing it in real time based on what information? Very often they're not using your FICO scores, they're using something else. I think that's where things get interesting. Like, and again, what is right? Like, what is the definition of right with this stuff? You know, there is no right. I think you try to put enough controls in place so that you know you're making decisions that you can justify, but there's no quote unquote, I think, right. Every business has got a different right.
Sure. And that does bring up the whole thing, right? So, you know, the real-time models, decisions are being made in real time. So how are you affecting that? Nick, you got a lot of experience in the real-time world, right?
Yeah, that again, what everything is we've been saying is correct. And I think when you talk about real time, you're using surrogates to a FICO score. Peter's absolutely correct. And now the question is what were those surrogates? What did I use in order to make that decision? I mean, when you're building a framework, the regulatory framework for a traditional bank is always at the base of the pyramid. You've got to follow what the law says. You have to do the Fair Lending Act in the United States. You go to the UK, you go to Europe, you go to anywhere, New Zealand, Australia, that's your base. The next part that's happening now is, all right, so on the next part of that pyramid, as you build it, there is ethics, and that's exactly where you want to be. But now the next question is, you know, did we do the right thing? Well, the question is to Peter's point, what is that right thing? Is this the right way? Is this the new FICO score, especially in real time? How can I make that decision to loan you $2,000 or $5,000 to buy the big screen TV, right? Or to put something else? That to me is where the challenge is. And that's what people are trying to figure out. And in many cases, these real-time fintechs are like, hopefully, you know, only, 3 in 10 loans go bad, or, that's the goal, because then the other 7 we can make profit off of. Well, what does that mean to you? How can you survive that way? And then et cetera, et cetera. Real time is you gotta get 3 or 4 pieces of information and make a decision in milliseconds. It's kind of like when you used to, when you do your credit card, I've got to figure out 3 or 5 things as you're using that credit card that says, yes, that's you. It's a legitimate purchase. What do you got? And this is now we're going a little bit beyond that, saying it's someone whom we may not know who's trying to get a loan, right? For something that, okay, I get that. And now, what do I need? What else do I need to know to say, yeah, you're credit worthy. Here's $5,000-$10,000 outside of, let's say, traditional credit card or, banking, what do you call it, the service or product that you have to go through in a more, systematic way. That's the challenge. And Peter hit it right on. That challenge is about, what is that thing to you? What are you going to determine that on? And again, real time is dangerous. It's also exciting, right? Because again, microloans make a difference for people when they're trying to get microloans across the world and trying to help people, raise their level of living, their standards of living. So there's a great opportunity there. It's just like Peter said, we're in the Wild West right now, and hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years it'll start to play out a little bit better for everyone to understand what decisions went into that real-time determination if you were creditworthy. And that's part of what we're talking about, right? What went into that AI or ML model that said, yeah, I don't need a FICO score, but I'll give you a $10,000 loan or a $5,000 loan, etc.
And bring that human element back in, what Marina mentioned. So we've been saying challenge a lot, but I'm looking at where you challenge the decisions. And so there's that feedback loop. So Ted, is that, where, in your experience with what you guys have done in your clients, is that, do you see that in the process, that human feedback loop?
Yeah, starting to see it more and more. As organizations are building things out, they're definitely looking to bring the human element into it, but they have to have, going back to that transparency, they have to understand what's going on to, bring this together and look at and work with different individuals within the organization, understand, is this correct or not correct, or is this ethical or not ethical, and then make those decisions based on the visibility that they have of what's going on. One of the things that's interesting as we're talking about the fintechs and the lending and creditworthiness is, the credit bureaus aren't required to even provide accurate data. If you are an AT&T or a Best Buy and the data is inaccurate, you're required to fix that data. But when you start looking at the creditworthiness of someone, you're just going off of a FICO score or some other credit bureau, that data inherently could be wrong and incorrect. And that's where I think you bring back in that human element of really looking at individuals, creditworthiness based on not only one variable such as a credit bureau, but multiple variables that might be going on, such as their rent history, their current income, so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm. So Peter, you make these things, like you're all this infrastructures and of machine learning and data science, and how does that fit in? Like, if decisions are made, you gotta look at it and then come back and try to, right? Because we're saying it's like there's no, you're not right or wrong. A decision was made, then you need to look at it, improve it. How does that work out?
Well, it depends what you're trying to do here. If you're a small consumer, do you even have the ability to question the fact that the decision was right or wrong more often than not? And the answer is most likely no, especially for all the small companies doing some of this work. So I think, these decisions get made and you move on. You have no ability to say, oh, hey, why did I get rejected for this credit? And hey, what are you using to make that decision? You just get rejected. I think that was true for even the FICO stores for a long time. You had no idea what there actually was behind the black box, what those scores mean, and how they were calculating those scores. I think we're in a lot of uncharted territory. Like Nick said, I think a lot of this stuff is very new, and there's a lot of things there's a lot of rules that are not there yet. There's a lot of regulations that are not there yet. So I think when you're a consumer, you're to a large degree you don't have a lot of avenues you can travel down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Marina, like another part of your background is your risk and governance and so forth, but a lot of the work you've been doing has been in the innovation space, right? Where's your thinking on? I guess you have to change the mindset at some point too, right? So you're within, especially in banking, right? You have this, you have heavy regulatory frameworks on top of it, but the individuals, right? You're speaking about like how individuals and relationship managers and so forth, they need to make decisions, and where I guess the mindset with all this technology that comes in, sort of changes. Is there anything you can, expand on that?
Yeah, so I think, so with innovation, effectively, the way I look at innovation, especially how we run it, is to make things more efficient, improve our bankers' lives as well as our customers' lives, and also just reduce the amount of time we spend on a lot of admin and a lot of complex processes that effectively, effectively we can make easier for our lives. And I do think, we definitely need to continue innovating, continue making things simpler, streamline, and ensure that we are making things a lot easier for our bankers and staff. But I think there still has to be a human element, given that the way I view it, right, we are responsible as bankers to ensure that the economic viability of our customers and the economies we're playing in is safe and we're making the right decisions. And until I think we have been working with these technologies and get a very high confidence level that everything is right, there still will be a human element. But what I would like to see, though, is that at the moment, and it's something Peter said earlier, is that when you think about AI, machine learning, automation, it's usually the back end people and the credit people that are helping engineers develop these tools. They understand it, they know what XYZ means. But the rest of the bank, which is probably 85%, the bankers, the relationship managers, even those in product, they don't quite understand how we come to a result, why we come to a result. And we need to start effectively educating them on how this works and really upskilling them on technology. And that's something we're doing. I think a lot of banks are doing, to be honest, and we have to, because if we expect relationship managers, which are effectively just sales guys, just to be sales guys as they are today in 10 years' time, that's probably not going to work. They need to understand the technologies and everything that is going to result in what we want as bankers, but also, we have clients. We need to be very confident that if we say we're going to give them $10 million, $20 million, that's actually going to eventuate. And then when we look at the models, it doesn't, and that's quite different. So I think we need them to kind of join the journey and understand it to improve that human element, really, and improve the AI element.
One thing I want to not let slide by here, and I think
Sure,
we get stuck on the negative side of all these arguments, which I think is natural. There's bias in this, and the data's bad in this. And I think if you look at what's been done the last, say, 5 years, with all these systems that have been developed, with credit on demand and helping the unbanked get banked and all this stuff, and look, there's going to always be problems. There's always going to be issues. There's always going to be we don't have perfect data. Or the model spit out a decision that was an incorrect decision for whatever reason. But the amount of people it's helped lift up their lives is, you can't even count it. You can't put a number to it. So for all the issues and problems that will always be with any model or any process, nothing's ever perfect, nothing's ever right. You try to justify the decisions, but the amount of people that have been lifted up in their lives because of this stuff is enormous.
Right.
Yeah, and I think part of that is as people get lifted up, Paul, Marino makes a good point. To me, I look at it, our opportunities, if you look at where people talk about people in data analytics, we have to tell stories, right? You have to be a data storyteller or an analytics interpreter. And that goes right to what Marino's saying, which is you've got to be able to put this in plain language. I usually try to work with people saying we have to also become, it's almost like being a parent, right? Where that parent has to explain to a child. And yes, people could get insulted. I'm not a child, but yes, most of you are if it comes to complex mathematical equations. Explain it in plain language. This is what we've done. And now then so that the child can both internalize and understand what it is. So you're a parent at that point. And you're also a parent to other components to it, is saying, should I be doing this? That's part of your framework. So even when you do innovation, you need to have someone sitting there and says, is this the right thing for us to do? Again, like a parent, is this the right thing for you to do? You know, I want to protect you if we go to a playground, but I'm also going to give you some freedom to run around the playground and enjoy yourself, you know, get on the slide, jump on the jungle gym, whatever that is. So I think as we're looking to, as we move forward, is we're helping people achieve their goals, to Peter's point, but we're also like a parent, we're going to help you achieve your goal, whether that's, you know, college or get a job, you know, or whatever, get the Xbox that you want. I don't care whatever it is, that thing you want. But I've got to help also explain. And I think that's been the harder part for a lot of folks is like, why do I have to sit there and have to explain things? It's just right. It's like, I get that, but you really have to start sitting there. And like Marino said, what does that mean? How do I educate you? You know, how did I build that model? Why was that model built this way? They don't care about, you know, is it epsilon? Is it X, Y? You know, that's like, but you got to interpret that to them so that they're like, oh, so you're trying to accomplish this. It did this. This is why we're able to do that. Again, it's about being a parent to me when it was where we're at. And that's the simplest way I can try to put it in my own mind is, yeah, you know, is that the right thing to do? Is that how do I explain this to you so you can actually, you know, understand it so that you can do it, right? Or you're comfortable, you have that trust. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, just you have to trust the people making decisions at some point too, right?
But you also have to question it too. So you got to
Yeah.
trust some of those folks, but you better be validated and verifying right now. Because again, I think the days of just implicit trust where, I get it, those days were 10 years ago. And everything that we've seen across, you know, as things have done is like, yeah, I need to validate and verify as you go this. It's like, you know, I got 2 teenage daughters. I do not trust any, you know, teenage boy who shows up at my door to come inside and say, hey, I'm here to visit, you know, your daughter. I'm like, guess what? I'm going to validate and verify. So come on in. I'm going to watch you, whatever it is. And eventually you'll get some of my trust so that I can give that to you. But again, as a thing, it's like, you've got to still validate and verify everyone. So it's like that zero trust, but you still, you know, it's that balance that we always have to play with.
Yeah. Ted, do you want to add anything to that?
It's a very interesting, and Peter brings up a great point of, you know, we brought up a lot of negatives about possible AI, but there's so much benefit that we're gaining from it. And when I start to look at, you know, what I'm seeing out there in the market and, you know, the validation aspect that Nick just brought up, you know, I've heard multiple times over and over from organizations that they're not able to get models out there on a quick, fast basis because they can't validate the model to their model validation and regulatory teams. So the nice thing about, you know, technology that's out there, trying not to sound like a marketing spin, but there is technology like a Fiddler out there that you can start to look at what's going on within the development phase. So you can start to provide that transparency and visibility of the data that's going into your models, how the different features are impacting your models. And then as you start to move it forward, it becomes that feedback loop. I think we all know that, you know, AI and ML is not a set it and forget it type of situation. You're going to put your model out there. It's immediately going to start to depreciate because of the data that's coming in. You're going to have to retrain your models and provide that visibility. And inherently, you know, I think humanity, I think people are looking to do the right thing. I think people are looking to create solutions that are going to benefit individuals and their organization. And does a lot have to be done? Yes, but I think we're on that path moving forward.
Good. You guys mind? I'm going to jump into some questions from the audience, and then anybody can jump in and on it. So one is, would you agree that it is not so much a question of eliminating bias, but of finding and implementing the right biases? So if an algorithm is designed to judge creditworthiness, then surely the end goal is for it to be biased towards those with strong credit. Anybody want to pick that up? Pete, I mean, it comes off of what you were talking earlier.
Yeah, no, I think I agree fundamentally with what they're saying. I mean, I would look, at the end of the day, bias is good. I hate to be blunt, but a bias is actually good. You have to have the right type of bias. I mean, clearly you know, if you're calculating somebody's risk when you want to lend the money, you're biased towards people that are low credit risk. I mean, that's clear. You don't want to all of a sudden, you know, say everybody has the same level of bias. It's not true. You don't want to have a bias, you know, for people that have a poor credit risk. I think that's a true statement. I think the struggle all along is getting the data to do that. That's always the problem. It's having the right set of data. But yes, that's absolutely correct. It's every model is inherently going to have a bias. You're designing models for bias by definition. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get an output based on data that you put into it. But yes, you can have bias. Is it the right bias? Again, I think we focus on the bad bias, and that's what you see in the news all the time. But again, you go for a mortgage. The models have bias. The bias was people would make good money and have good credit risk. Of course, that's natural.
And that talks to the strategy of the business also,
Yeah.
right? Marina, you're nodding a lot. Yeah, want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, yeah, obviously with creditworthiness, right, there will be an element of bias depending on who can afford them what and the most and, all that jazz. And end of the day, banks and businesses do need to make money. So, there will effectively be an element of bias, but it's ensuring that you're not making decisions that are just not on creditworthiness, but it doesn't result because of gender or because we don't like a specific organization or whatever it is for specific reasons, ensuring that doesn't really happen. But agree with Peter completely.
Yeah, but the one thing is when you look at when you put things in, what I like is bankers are no longer just saying no. So let's just take a mortgage, for example, where someone comes in and says, I want a $500,000 US mortgage. And it's kind of like before this person didn't have creditworthiness, it was like, no, denied. On to the next one. Now what I have started seeing with banking customers is like, Nick, you don't really qualify for a 500,000, but let's do something good. I know you want a home. Here's the mortgage you do qualify for. So let's help you get into the house because that's the ultimate goal. You want to own a home, but you're just not going to be able to afford at this point, because you're, based upon maybe age and your income, a $500,000 home, but you could afford, let's say, a $250,000 or $300,000 home at this point. So let's figure out a way to get you where you want to go. But, it's now a decent bias saying if I put you in that home, you'll probably be bankrupt in 2 years. But if we do this, you become financially, you'll still have a good, your finances will be in good shape. That's what I think my transition I've seen with bankers now. It's no longer just saying, nope, don't get it, on to the next application. It's let me show you potentially how we can help you achieve what you're doing, which to me, to Peter's point, is the good bias, right? Let's just show you what's possible, right?
I'm glad you brought that up because when we think about creditworthiness, again, people think about yes or no. Do you get it or don't you get it? But what you're bringing up is, and this goes with the trend in terms of, people are always looking for a more customized experience with their bank, right, or with their financial provider, and it's that building up the relationships. And what you just described is building the relationship of, hey, I know you asked for this, but this is probably a better thing for you, based on what we know.
Nick is spot on. I think this is absolutely correct. And I think this is where technology is an enormous benefit, is you can do hyper-personalization. You can have these discussions with people. You can say, look, you know what, maybe not available for the $500,000 loan, but I can give you the $400,000 or $300,000 loan. And that's where these tools are immensely beneficial because you can get super personalized. It's not just a very set of rigid rules anymore. And banks want to, banks want to keep business. They want to lend you money. They make money off of this. I mean, this is what they want to do. They don't want to tell you no.
Yeah, no, that's good.
I agree, and I've got an interesting story, right? So I've only been in America for 2.5 years. So I've lived in Australia, New Zealand, a little bit in Asia, and when I came here, I didn't have a social security number or a credit score. I didn't even know what really a credit score was at that point. And I opened my bank accounts, etc. And then I said, "Oh, can I get a credit card?" And they said, "Yeah, you can do it online." And I won't name the bank. And then I went online and applied and said I can only apply for like a $2,000 limit. I was a little bit shocked and I was like, okay. And I applied and they denied me and I was like, oh, okay, this is not great. And then I tried again and I got denied and I was like, okay, I don't know what's going on. So I rang the bank and I talked to the person I did when I opened my bank accounts. And she did explain the whole process, and automatically you'll get denied if you don't have a credit score, you don't have XYZ. But did give me another solution to help build it up and show that I have bank accounts elsewhere. So I think that relationship is important, because if I didn't have that person, I would have just got a bit paid off at this bank and probably just gone to Amex or something. So that is very important, and it is going to be important in terms of relationships.
Excellent. Ted, you want to add anything to that?
I think that's a great story, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this session. Is there enough data there to make an accurate representation of whether or not somebody should be receiving some type of credit or loan? Are we taking into account all the different variables out there, such as an individual who's paying $4,000 a month and maybe live in an apartment? That's not being calculated when you start looking at somebody's credit worthiness and whether or not we should give them a loan. So in the United States, there's over 26 million people who have no credit history. So I think it's a very difficult thing for the banks. What do you bring into the equation that's going to be accurate and make good business decision on when you are going to provide credit or a loan? And to Marina's point, he had to go in and actually do something on his own. If he would have just gone through the normal channels and gone through and tried to apply online, he would have been denied and not been able to receive his credit card.
Yep. So let's talk about, there's another question here that I want to go into. It really starts talking about data, and we brought that up quite a bit. Bias could be in an algorithm, but what about the existing data? Would it be a huge task to process this data for potential bias, and would this be the sticking point for progress? And Nick, I'd like you to start off on this one, because within the current work that you're doing now and data privacy and de-identification and all those things, like when you look at, you can take elements out that might bring in a negative bias, I guess. Do you want to talk a little bit about that from the data point of view?
Well, the biggest part is the harder part that we're going through right now is with data itself, is your data classification. That's probably a lot of work that's been done in the last 2 years, is just being able to understand the data that's flowing into the organization. Again, because it's coming in from, hundreds of places. Now, once you're able to say, okay, this is personal data, this is sensitive data, which we have to do in any type of banking regulated world. Sensitive data is Fair Lending Acts, things like that. You can't use potentially in your, if you're making a decision on credit. So you need to be able to understand that. But then I think the other part is where we do a lot of work is, what about that data that acts as, and I'll say the term again, a surrogate that actually can identify that sensitive portion of that data? There are certain attributes that can do that. Believe it or not, even your work, you could sit back and say, if I bring in your behavioral attributes into this model, I can actually surmise if you are, what ethnic group you are from, if you are male or female, if you are X, Y, and Z. So now the question is these other elements that are coming in, these pseudo identifiers, that's where you really have to work it, because I may be applying data protection methods to say, yeah, I understand that's going to help me communicate in a marketing message to someone. However, I've actually unbeknownst to me, have created a potential way that I've identified potentially someone's ethnic background, gender, etc. This sensitive data that I should not have. That's the gray areas that we're playing in now. It's no longer, we've got a lockdown of, you can't put this element in there directly, but now you're sitting back saying, what about these other ones that I can actually piece together to find out, unfortunately, things that I shouldn't if I'm trying to make a loan to you. It's those pseudo identifiers that you always got to be working through now. And that's why in data classification, you got to know those toxic combinations. If I put this together, I've now found out something that maybe I shouldn't have, which then could potentially influence the decision that's about to be made. That's the hard part. That's really what the challenge, part of the bigger challenges that we're facing today is how do we start to put those together and identify them and make sure, we can either include them or exclude them from getting inside of a machine learning model. That's why you see federated learning, homomorphic encryption, you see differential privacy. All those new methods are coming to the forefront because it helps us do things like identify those pseudo identifiers.
Yeah. Peter, you want to add to that, because you're doing a lot of work in that space too?
Yeah, no, I actually got more of a question than anything else, actually, to Nick. With
Awesome. We love questions.
I throw a question back instead, because it's a hypothetical question. I mean, by doing some of this work and by masking some of this out, are we degrading the quality of what we're producing, the models that are getting produced, the results that are being produced, which I think, honestly, the probability is we probably are.
And actually, you bring a good point, Peter, because a lot of the work I do with people is actually how to make sure that we can include them without creating the identifier. So when some people's like, yeah, I don't believe you should just eliminate the data out of the data set. I'm like, there's certain things we can do. We can perturb data, right? That's a different technique that I can use. I can apply, potentially k-anonymity, right? I can put k-anonymity into the model itself in order for us to do that. So the question is like, I need to identify if these things are happening, because then I can apply instead of today, most people just like, oh, I encrypted the data. Oh, I took it out of the list, right? Those are the two go-to methods.
Those are the
right?
default answers.
Yeah, I just lost 20 columns. But, I'm a data scientist like yourself. I'm like, I don't want to lose those 20 columns because they can be useful to me. So the question now is, I've got, 25 to 35 different ways to protect data from these certain things that I can apply that keeps the utility, I call it the utility of the data, intact so that it can be used. So what should I be doing, right? I create the protection. I can take away some of the bias, but I can also see that those things get included. So that to me is that's a lot of the work I do today. Is like, I don't want to just throw stuff out. I don't want to exclude, and I don't just want to say encryption for all, tokenization for all. What else can I do? Again, we're very smart people from a technology standpoint. We have different methods. When should those methods be applied so that data can still be very useful in the analysis? Did that help answer the question?
No, totally. Spot on. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and I guess if you start removing all that data, you have nothing to look at to challenge, right, Marina?
Yeah.
It's like, well, what do you have to work with to say, okay, a decision was made?
Yeah, and then you don't have a decision at that point. Again, that's the craziness of it all. All of a sudden, it's like, if I take this out, all these fintechs who created other ways to determine credit worthiness, right, other than a FICO score. If you're like, well, I got to take that out, what are you left with? Oh, I got to have a FICO score. Now you're back to where you started, right? And to those 26 million Americans, well, not to mention the probably 1.2 billion that don't have a credit score worldwide, I've got to make decisions, because those microloans do mean something to a lot of folks, to Peter's point. And that's like, okay, what else? I don't want to exclude, I want to include. And that's the important part, is how do you do that? Both in analysis as well as, trying to help with it. That's
a great point, right? You don't want to exclude, you want to include.
Oh,
yeah.
Right. That's good for business. It's good for people.
Right. At the end of the day, exactly. I mean, we want to, paint people in banks as being benevolent, but at the end of the day, it's a business decision. I mean, they want to make money, and they look at a pool of people. It's 1 billion people that don't have credit. Well, like, well, how do I get them credit? But they don't have credit scores. They don't really have, credit histories. They don't have credit cards. Well, how do I fix that problem? What do I look at? And then there are answers, and there's a lot of solutions out there that have been used before. Whether they're good or bad, I don't know. But it's a business decision.
Yep. Anybody want to add to that, or I'll go on to? I got an interesting question coming up. No? Okay. So this creditworthiness decisions, and I don't know what the EU. I haven't looked at their policies, but creditworthiness decisions made by AI are classified as high risk in the proposed EU AI Act. What do you think needs to be done to prepare financial services institutions, including fintech, for that? But also, I'd like to say, do you think AI decisions are high risk? It seems kind of blanketed.
No, I think that's a dangerous slope. That's a dangerous slope that they're going down. I think they're going to stop innovation because they're viewing it as a high-risk venture. I think, yes, it lacks explainability to a large degree, and I think that's what drives people crazy, that they can't explain this. But I think just blanketing and saying that a particular decision is high risk because it's using AI intelligence is, I think that is dangerous to me.
Yeah, so it probably links to another question I think someone asked around how capable are banking regulators to understand and regulate use of AI. So whenever I look at regulations or legislation around the world, and it's very extreme in terms of very conservative on how they approach AI or machine learning, it shows me that the regulators probably don't understand it. And really it's around the banking regulators, the regulators in general, in the financial system are generally a couple of years behind just normal legislation, privacy, etc. Right? When you chuck in AI and machine learning, they're like probably, in my view, 10 years behind. There's some countries where I believe the regulators kind of get it. So, Singapore's quite good. I think Hong Kong's okay. Even Australia and New Zealand is coming up to speed, but they're a lot smaller, right? You got a smaller population to work with. But when you look at Europe, big parts of Asia, and probably America, they are very behind in understanding how to put the correct regulation to ensure we don't stop innovation, we don't actually stop the world from moving and actually improving bias, because the whole point of AI and machine learning and banking and credit worthiness is to give more access to credit, right? That's what banks and fintechs, etc., are trying to do. But sometimes I look at regulators and I think they are trying to say, actually is trying to stop it because they don't understand it, they don't have the skill set. So it's a two-part play, and legislation like that effectively stops innovation.
Yeah, and I think you made a spot on. Regulators traditionally and always have lagged the banks, always, by years.
Yeah.
And they discover problems in hindsight of failure. That's always the problem.
Yeah, and they're always risk adverse. I mean, that's why, I know the one you're talking about, Paul, because we're actually in discussions with them to say it isn't high risk, what you're describing. I mean, that's one of the other parts of what I get to do is actually work with the regulators to say, try to talk, I call them, talk them off the ledge, right? It's like, guys, you don't understand. This is not Terminator where we're just going to leave the AI and machine learning model alone. To Marino's point, someone's watching, someone's actually looking at that model. It has to be, we have to continuously look at it. There is a human element to AI. There is a human element to machine learning that, again, it's just not like, let it go. I mean, and that's the part that they have to try to understand, because they're like, oh my God, I saw this on whatever special or TV movie that I just saw, the AI ran amok. It's like, because we left it alone. We don't. The opportunity here is we are doing as much as we can, especially with like people like For Humanity, to basically allow you that transparency, that allow you that end-to-end ability to take a look at what we're doing. And that gives you a chance to actually inspect, just like any auditor, which is pretty much as I started with Arthur Anderson as an auditor. If I can show you the workflow, if I can show you what I'm doing, you have a little bit more comfort level. Whereas a lot of these guys, just like, well, I don't understand math. I don't want you to. It's going back to Marino's point. I just need you to understand what was done. I don't need you to understand the mathematics. I need to understand, what is happening. What's the workflow? What's this? That's the part that you got to talk them off the ledge from.
Well, I think it's any new technology. I think it's an evolution. People have to get used to understanding what its capabilities are. I mean, you can have this discussion. It's fine. So an interesting comic this morning on one of the papers I was reading when I got up, and it's from like 1902, and it's people dying in the street because they were deploying electricity. Everybody's freaking out about the deployment of electricity and putting up wires, and oh my God, we can't have this happen. I think it's in some sense where the news today and the media today is in many respects anti-AI, and they bring up all the horror cases about facial recognition and everything else. And I think the default reaction is AI is bad. Well, it's not bad. There's enormous benefits to it, and it's going to take people time to technology and using it.
Yeah, and getting back to, it's like Marina, we were talking about, with transparent and explainability and getting the relationship manager, the frontliner, frontline office, who have the relationships with people to understand how things were made and that sort of thing. It's like you almost have to do the same thing with regulators.
Exactly. I guess to answer that question on what financial service institutions need to do to prepare for this is they really do need, not just the engineers, but people who can translate complex language into simple language and explain it to regulators and auditors and external auditors, and actually have institutions like AI for Humanity as well to back or review and provide independent views. I think that is going to be a huge help, because we're coming into this new decade or the next 20 years where I don't think the regulators are going to solve for everything, and they need to be held, their hands need to be held and taken on a journey by both the banks, organizations like AI for Humanity, but also independent auditors and consulting firms, etc. It's going to be a big transition of knowledge and trust.
Yep. And Ted, I mean, in your work, I mean, you're with your customers, but like, are you touching the regulatory side of things and trying to bring that clarity?
Absolutely. I mean, we're dealing with, one of the major verticals that we go after is the financial services vertical, and that explainability aspect. And what's nice about, not only Fiddler, but technologies like Fiddler is there is that ability to be able to explain what's going on with a model, not only from a statistical and mathematical point of view, but also breaking that down into, I call it dumbing it down for people like myself, business folks who can understand, in not so technical terms, exactly why the decisions were made within that model. What went into that model? What were the features that, and the inputs that were going into it, and what's the output, and why were those decisions made?
Excellent. So we got about 10 minutes. Wow, this is going by pretty fast, isn't it? So we got about 10 minutes left, and one of the things I want to talk about is, and this is really a brainstorming thing. It's like, okay, what are the elements? And we talked about, Marina talked about it, like, the kind of people that we need to be able to explain things and stuff like that. It's like, what are the elements of a framework that would ensure better decisions and creditworthiness and so forth? So we talked about one is, the data, being able to not obfuscate everything, but being the utility of the data, right? Other things we talked about is, what Marino says, like having people there to be able to explain these complicated, complex scenarios that people can understand. Opening it up is like, what are the elements of it? Because in the end, I want to get a bullet point, and then I'll write a blog post on this. And I'll put your names on it, of course. What are the elements of a good credit worthiness risk framework? So Peter, why don't you just throw some stuff out?
I knew you were going to put me on a spot there.
Yeah, no, I always do that.
I have to think about it. I'm not even sure what would be the good elements of it. I mean, clearly, God, I mean.
Well, we talk about measurement too, right? Like what?
Yeah, I mean, the measurement of what? Measurement of the output at the end of the day. I think, what's a good framework is guaranteeing that the data that you're using for these models is, you have a deeper understanding, I guess, of the data that you're putting into the models would probably be the first thing in my mind. Making sure that what you're putting into them is really what you think you're putting into it, and not something completely different. I'm not sure how you go about doing that, but that would be my first gut.
Mm-hmm. And Marino, you mentioned in terms of like measuring, I'm thinking about measuring success, right? You talked about like reducing the time of all the administrative stuff, right?
Yeah.
And how would that then benefit?
So there's two elements. I think definitely in a framework, you need to ensure that the data you're using is appropriate and correct for the decision you're making. And then B, in terms of creditworthiness and improving it, you just need to be able to ensure that the outputs can be explained in a very simple, non-complex manner in terms of how you got to that decision. Not explaining all the elements of it, but how you got to a particular decision in simple language. I don't know how to put that in a framework language, but yeah.
For me, Paul, I take the credit risk framework and I break it into three places of risk, right? There's the business risk, the financial risks, and the structured risks. So the business risks is basically, what country am I operating in? What's the macroeconomy and microeconomy look like? what's the industry that we're playing in, and what's the company or person's position, right? So what are they going to use the potential funds for? Then we get the financial. It's about revenue and profitability. Is this going to be a profitable loan? Because again, to your point, you're in the business to make money, right? So it's about, okay, is my revenue and profitability going to be here based upon this? What's my asset management in this particular world that I'm playing with? That's the financial risk. Am I overweighted in this particular industry or X, Y, and Z? And then it's about, okay, what's my debt capacities and leverages as you start to work through the financial risks. And then it comes down to what's the transaction about, right? So what is this for? Is it a microloan? Is it a mortgage? It is a business loan? Is it a bridge loan, or whatever that is? As I take a look at it, those are the 3 points: my business risk, my financials, and then my structure. And they all build upon each other as you move up, so that you can make that decision. The nice part is, with Marino's folks, they make this pretty much intuitively because their bankers are sitting there with you, right? We're actually trying to put this into, mathematics. How do you begin to play that up and work through it?
Ted?
I gotta be honest, Paul. I gotta let this one go. I'm learning here. I'm not a practitioner. These guys, I'm learning stuff and evaluating, thinking about how these guys are thinking, and pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, no, I wanted to throw a hard question at the end just to get us, start the regular day that we have. But part of that, I guess, is like in terms of framework, is you have to have a clear strategy, right? Strategy. What's the business strategy, right? Because we talked about it's based on the strategy. I mean, if you're doing micro loans, right, you have a different strategy than doing large institutional type stuff. And think about it's the data that you're putting in there, correct, for that, right? And then the other piece is that you need that element of human intervention, right, to challenge the things, right? Yeah. So let's see, any more?
If I may, Mike Nash asked, should auditors be experts in AI and ML? The answer is no, but auditors need to know potentially the language that is used in AI and ML, just like AI and ML need to know the language of what auditors use. So they don't need to be experts, but you do need to be able to understand what's being told you as well. So,
yep.
Right. So you need to be able to have an intelligent conversation.
There you go. Which my wife asks for every night, but she never gets over dinner. But it's okay.
Well, I mean, it comes down to transparency and explainability across all levels, right? So, so we're going to end up a little early just because there's a lot of other events going on here, and give some people time to take bathroom breaks and so on and so forth. So what I want to do is leave off on any final comments. Reflect on what we spoke about today. Marina, anything?
Yeah, I think we've got a long way to go, and it's exciting and it's good, but we're just really at the start of this journey. And what I'm looking forward to, especially in my role and probably the next couple of years, is taking our business, our bankers on that journey and helping them understand. Because as bankers, you're just focused on sales and customer and client, but the future bankers, whatever it is you do need to have an understanding of technology and be able to explain that. And taking them on that journey, it's going to be challenging, but it'll be interesting as well, because I think everyone's realizing they need those skills. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying you need coding skills, you just need to understand how something works, and that's as basic as I can put it. So that will be interesting, and then seeing how regulators are going to really start focusing and improving themselves, because they got to kind of up their skills as well.
All right. And Nick, any final comments?
But the biggest thing is stop managing data, become stewards of people's data, which is what we said, which is that about that trust, about that commitment, about that responsibility. Think of it like being a parent. And probably the most important thing is we have to have patience to both explain what we're doing, uncover the black box, peel back down, whatever metaphor you want to use, I've been trying to learn patience my whole life. I continue to do that. And that's the biggest part now, is just being patient to be able to explain these things to folks are the big parts.
Great. Thank you. Ted?
I'd just like to say thank you, Paul, for the invite. I've been able to share some information, but I've also learned a great deal, and appreciate the other panelists. I will say that I do agree with Marina that we're at the beginning stages of what's going to transpire, but those technologies are there today to help move this along faster, to help provide that transparency and that explainability of what's going on, that can only help people not only get their models out faster, but build more accurate and models that you would expect to be performing for the business aspects of which you built them. So it's an interesting journey. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I think we're in a great place, and I think the innovation is going to be moving forward and provide the world a great deal of benefit.
Great. And Pete, I know you the most, so I left you for last.
That's fine. I could say a lot. I know we have a couple minutes left. I think we're on a very, very, very long journey here. I think this is going to be a multi-decade journey. We're at the very beginning of this world. I don't think there's any right or wrong answers. I think my strategy is your bias, or my bias is not your bias, or whatever you want to call it. We're on a very long road, and I think I think we have this tendency to view certain things like bias as bad, and they're not. And I think we have to shift the conversation to some degree to the benefits of the technology and what's being developed, and the benefits to all individuals in society, and lifting people up. And I think we forget that sometimes, and I think we get lost in the weeds of, well, it's bias, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. It's not. Mm-hmm. There's been immense amount of good done with all this technology, and I think again we're at the very beginning roads of a multi-decade road of what's going to be accomplished with this stuff, and we can't forget that. And we have to shift the conversation to a positive note.
Great.
Amen.
Hey, so I want to give a plug, because there's a 10 o'clock. I'm going to invite everybody to take a break and go on to the next one at 10 o'clock session. But what's going to be interesting, it's about healthcare, but it's also HR, so human resources. And a lot of what we talked about is about people and having the right people in place and so forth. So I think that would be a really interesting session for people to go to. So I want to thank, Nick, Peter, Ted, Marino. Thank you for your expertise and your time today. I really enjoyed it. I'm not kidding about writing a blog post on this, so you'll be seeing some more. And I'll probably have a diagram of some sort. But thank you everybody for joining, and take a break right now and join us into the next sessions. All right. So thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for your help.